Sylvester Stallone destroys liberal TV host who tried to humiliate him. His response shocked everyone. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this dream too. The podcast host, a well-known liberal activist named Jane, had spent the past week preparing for her interview with Sylvester Stallone. She had a reputation for questioning celebrities on their political stances, often with a confrontational approach. For her, Stallone, the beloved action star of the 80s and 90s, was an easy target. He had spoken out on several controversial topics in the past, which only made him more enticing for her to challenge. The studio was sleek and modern, a place where the brightest minds of the liberal movement came to share their thoughts. The lights shone brightly, and Jane adjusted the mic, her voice calm but dripping with anticipation. The episode was going to be monumental. She had planned everything meticulously: the questions, the tone, and even the pauses for maximum impact. As Stallone walked in, he exuded the usual charm and poise. Dressed casually, but with a presence that demanded attention, he was far from the overbearing figure Jane had imagined. She expected a gruff response, perhaps an awkward laugh, but nothing like what was about to unfold. She offered him a handshake, but her mind was already racing with the question she was about to ask. "Mr. Stallone," she began, her voice oozing with confidence, "you've had quite a career, but your political views, they seem a bit out of touch with the times, don't you think? Especially with how your movies glorify violence and toxic masculinity." This was the setup. Jane could already picture the backlash from her listeners. But she wasn't prepared for Stallone's reaction. Instead of defensive posturing, a smirk formed on his lips, and his eyes twinkled with amusement. He leaned forward, his voice calm, but it carried a weight that immediately quieted the room. Jane's question hung in the air, the tension palpable. She had anticipated a defensive reaction, but Stallone's calm response was unexpected. For a brief moment, there was silence as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the armrest with a deliberate rhythm. His eyes never left hers. "You think that's what defines me?" Stallone's voice was surprisingly soft, almost contemplative. "Violence? Toxic masculinity?" He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Well, I think you've got it wrong, Jane. Let me tell you something." The room was still. Jane had expected him to react more aggressively, to lash out. Instead, his calmness only amplified the weight of his words. "People like to talk about how my movies glorify violence," he continued. "But violence isn't something I've ever glorified. It's something I've shown in a way that's real, a way that reflects human struggle. In all of us, there's a battle, internally, externally. That's what I've tried to capture in my films." Jane shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her carefully prepared follow-up questions suddenly feeling inadequate. She had thought she was prepared for this moment, but Stallone's response was far deeper than she had anticipated. "You know," he said, leaning forward now, "it's easy to label things, to put them in neat little boxes. But life's messier than that. And so are the characters I've played." Jane's mind raced, but she was determined not to let him off the hook so easily. "But isn't it irresponsible to romanticize men who solve problems with their fists? How does that reflect on society today?" she shot back. Stallone paused, as though carefully considering her words. "I don't romanticize violence, Jane. What I show is that the real strength comes not from fighting, but from what you learn through that struggle. The pain, the consequences." There was something in his tone that made her doubt her previous stance. She had expected to win this exchange, but Stallone's words were powerful, too powerful to dismiss with a quick rebuttal. For a moment, the audience was stunned into silence, hanging on every word. Jane had made a name for herself as a hard-hitting, no-nonsense interviewer, always ready to challenge her guests and push them to their limits. But this time, Stallone was different. Instead of giving her the opportunity to tear into him, he was offering something far more profound, a glimpse into his soul, into the humanity behind the tough guy persona. Her next question came with less conviction, but she tried to steer the conversation back to the heart of the matter. "So, are you saying that your roles like Rocky, Rambo, they're about showing human struggle rather than promoting harmful ideals?" Stallone smiled, but it wasn't the cocky grin of a Hollywood star. It was the smile of someone who had lived through their own battles. Exactly. Rocky, for instance, wasn't about a guy who could punch his way through problems. It was about a guy who didn't give up, even when the world kept knocking him down. It's about resilience, heart. It's about fighting for something bigger than yourself. Jane had never heard him speak like this before. Her usual tactic of challenging her guests had fallen flat. Stallone wasn't just defending himself. He was educating her in a way she hadn't expected. He had reduced her argument to something almost trivial, and yet she knew she couldn't dismiss his words. There was a power to his conviction that hit her like a punch. "And what about Rambo?" she asked, still trying to find a foothold. "Isn't that a glorification of war, of violence?" Stallone's expression changed slightly, a flicker of something deeper in his eyes. "Rambo isn't just about fighting," he said quietly. "It's about a man who has been broken by the system, forced to fight when all he wants is peace. It's a tragedy, not a celebration of war." His words were heavy, and Jane suddenly felt the weight of them. She was no longer in control of this interview. Stallone had shifted the power dynamic in a way she hadn't anticipated. He was no longer the star of the '80s action flick she had grown up watching. He was a man with a message, and she was the one struggling to keep up. The discussion had taken a turn, and Jane was now on the defensive. She could feel the eyes of the audience on her, some silently agreeing with Stallone, others perhaps still hoping she would regain control of the conversation. But Jane could feel something shifting inside her. Was she being too narrow in her perspective? Could it be that the man in front of her had more depth than she had given him credit for? For the first time, Jane hesitated. She had always prided herself on her quick wit and her ability to dismantle arguments. But Stallone's responses had forced her to rethink her approach. His words weren't just answers. They were challenges, philosophical reflections that made her question the very foundation of her beliefs. His calmness was disarming, and the sincerity in his voice made it impossible for her to dismiss his thoughts as mere celebrity rhetoric. "Mr. Stallone, you speak about resilience, but isn't there a danger in presenting violence as a solution? Doesn't it send the wrong message to people, especially younger viewers, that violence is the answer to personal struggles?" Jane's voice was softer now, a shift from her usual sharp tone. Stallone's expression softened, and for a moment, he seemed to consider her words deeply. "Look, Jane," he said, his voice steady but warm, "I'm not telling people to go out and fight their problems. What I'm saying is that life will challenge you. It will break you down, sometimes in ways you can't control. What matters is how you rise from that, what you choose to do with the scars you've earned. That's what I try to show in my movies." There was a pause as the weight of his words hung in the air. The studio was silent, and even Jane found herself contemplating the depth of what he had said. It wasn't about glorifying violence. It was about illustrating the human condition, the struggle to overcome, the choice to fight or to surrender. Stallone leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense yet thoughtful. "We all have our own battles, Jane. It's not about picking up a weapon. It's about picking yourself up when the world's knocking you down. That's what people need to see. They need to see that they can overcome anything if they don't give up." Jane felt a shift within herself. This wasn't the confrontation she had expected, the sharp clash of ideals. It was a conversation, a challenge to her own assumptions. She had come in ready to confront a Hollywood star and expose his flaws, but instead, she found herself questioning her own. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Her mind was swirling, trying to reconcile the Stallone sitting in front of her with the image she had held of him all these years. "Are you saying that there's more to your movies than I've given credit for?" she asked, her voice quieter, more reflective than before. Stallone's lips curled into a small smile. "Exactly. Maybe it's time to look beyond the surface and see the message we're really trying to tell." The silence in the studio was deafening. Jane's mind raced as she tried to make sense of Stallone's words. She had expected a celebrity meltdown, a defensive rant, or a quick comeback. But what she got was a man who spoke with a depth she hadn't anticipated. She had come in ready to expose his contradictions, but now she felt the sharp sting of her own misconceptions. As the minutes ticked by, Jane struggled to find the right words. The audience was still, the only sound being the faint hum of the studio's air conditioning. She had asked the question, But now she wasn't sure what she was hoping for. Was she looking for an apology, a reason to continue her argument? Or was she simply looking for a response that aligned with her worldview? "I'll admit," she said finally, breaking the silence, "I didn't expect you to say that. I thought you'd defend your characters as heroic figures, as symbols of strength through violence." Stallone's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time in the interview, he seemed to soften, almost as if he was letting her into his world, a place where strength wasn't about muscles or power, but about resilience and the courage to change. "My characters aren't perfect, Jane. They're broken, just like all of us. They're flawed, they make mistakes, but they fight. They fight because they know the battle isn't over until they say it is. And that's the lesson I want people to walk away with. Not that violence is the answer, but that life is a fight, and you can either give up or keep pushing forward." Jane nodded, her earlier confidence waning. She had been so quick to judge, so eager to dissect and criticize. But here she was, listening to a man whose work had touched millions, a man who was speaking not as a Hollywood icon, but as someone who had lived through his own battles. "I can see that now," she said quietly, her voice betraying a sense of humility. "But it's hard, when the world constantly tells you to fight for your own survival, to fight for what's yours. How do you know when to stop? When does it become destructive instead of redemptive?" Stallone's expression grew thoughtful. "That's the question we all have to answer for ourselves. But the truth is, we all have the power to choose. We choose whether to fight the right battles or not. We choose how we handle the pain, how we handle the scars. And that's where the real strength comes from." The weight of his words settled in Jane's chest, and for the first time in the interview, she felt vulnerable. It was as if Stallone had stripped away the layers of her arguments and exposed something deeper, something raw and real. She had come in with the intention of humbling him, but now she found herself humbled by his wisdom. The moment lingered for a few seconds, and then, almost as if the tension had been released, Jane let out a small sigh. She wasn't sure what else to say, but she felt a shift. The dynamic had changed, and she wasn't in control anymore. But for the first time, it didn't matter. Stallone's calm demeanor had broken through her walls, and she had learned something in the process. Maybe it wasn't about exposing his flaws. Maybe it was about seeing beyond the surface and recognizing the humanity in the people we so easily judge. "Thank you," Jane said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for reminding me of that." The studio lights felt warmer now, the tension of the interview slowly dissolving. Jane could see the shift in the atmosphere. The audience was more at ease, some nodding in agreement with Stallone's reflections. Jane herself, despite her usual stance of control, felt an unfamiliar sense of respect for the man in front of her. Stallone had done something no one had ever done before. He had shifted the focus of the conversation back to something real, something raw. For a moment, Jane simply sat there, absorbing the silence. The usual rapid-fire questioning, the sparring for a gotcha moment, seemed unnecessary now. She had come into this interview with her own set of assumptions, a plan to call out the flaws she thought she could easily pinpoint. But instead, she had found herself on the receiving end of something much deeper, a challenge to her own beliefs, a chance to reflect on her own perceptions. "Mr. Stallone," she said finally, her voice softer than it had been before, "I have to admit, I came into this interview expecting to confront you on things I thought I understood. But now, I'm starting to realize maybe I was too quick to judge." Stallone's smile was small, but genuine, as if he knew exactly what she was feeling. "It's easy to judge, Jane. It's easy to see someone through the lens of a movie poster or a headline. But when you get to know the person, when you hear their story, things change." Jane nodded, feeling a wave of realization wash over her. She had spent so much time on her podcast trying to challenge others, trying to make them uncomfortable with their views. But in doing so, she had closed herself off from the opportunity to truly listen, to really understand where someone else was coming from. "Your movies," Jane began, almost tentatively, "have always been seen as representations of toughness, of strength. But I never really considered them as reflections of vulnerability, of the human side of that strength." Stallone leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed. "Strength doesn't come from being invincible, Jane. It comes from being vulnerable, from showing up even when you're broken. The strength in my characters is that they're not afraid to show their weakness. The words hit Jane like a wave. For the first time, she realized that her own perspective had been one-dimensional. She had always admired strength in others, but perhaps she had missed the deeper meaning behind it. Strength wasn't about power. It wasn't about dominating others. It was about confronting one's own fears and limitations and still moving forward. Maybe I've been looking for the wrong thing all along, Jane said quietly. I thought strength was about conquering the world around you, but it's really about facing what's inside you, isn't it? Stallone nodded, his eyes meeting hers. Exactly. It's not the battles we fight with others that define us. It's the ones we fight with ourselves, and how we choose to face them. For the first time in the interview, Jane didn't feel the need to respond with a rebuttal. The conversation had come full circle, and she realized that this wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a moment of personal growth. Stallone had opened her eyes to something she hadn't considered before, and in doing so, he had shifted the narrative of the conversation entirely. As she sat there looking at Stallone, Jane realized that this was the kind of conversation she wanted to have. Not one that tore people down, but one that made them think, reflect, and grow. She wasn't sure how the audience would respond, but in that moment, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. The interview was coming to a close, and Jane could feel the shift in energy. The atmosphere had gone from confrontational to contemplative, and the audience, who had initially been braced for an intense showdown, now seemed to appreciate the unexpected turn of the conversation. There was a quiet respect in the air, a recognition that something deeper had transpired between Jane and Stallone. As the cameras began to wind down, Jane's mind was still racing. She had come into this interview expecting to be the one in control, to challenge Stallone, to expose the flaws she assumed were hidden behind his celebrity persona. But in reality, he had done the challenging. He had forced her to confront her own assumptions, to see the world in a way she hadn't considered before. And in the process, he had subtly shifted the conversation from judgment to understanding. "Thank you, Mr. Stallone," Jane said, her voice now carrying a hint of sincerity she hadn't intended when she first began the interview. "I came into this thinking I had you figured out, but I've learned a lot today." Stallone smiled, but it wasn't the typical media smile. It was a smile of mutual respect. "Sometimes it takes someone to ask the hard questions to make you think," he said, "but sometimes the harder part is being open enough to listen to the answers." Jane nodded, grateful for the reminder. She had always prided herself on being outspoken, on pushing others to question their beliefs. But today, she had been the one who had to listen, really listen, to someone else's perspective. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't what she had expected, but it was exactly what she needed. As the cameras stopped rolling, Jane took a deep breath, her usual composure returning, but something within her had changed. She had gone through the motions of countless interviews before, always following a script, always in control of the narrative. But this interview, this moment, was different. It had been a true exchange of ideas, a genuine conversation, and she realized how rare that was in her line of work. Stallone stood up, ready to leave, but not before offering a final thought. "You know, Jane," he said with a thoughtful smile, "the world needs more conversations like this. We spend so much time trying to prove who's right or wrong, but we forget that we're all just trying to make sense of this crazy world. Maybe if we listened a little more, we'd understand each other a lot better." His words lingered in the air long after he left, and Jane sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the conversation. The interview had been meant to challenge Stallone, to catch him off guard, but instead, it had been she who had been caught off guard. And in that vulnerability, in that moment of reflection, Jane realized that the real strength wasn't in being the loudest voice in the room. It was in being able to listen, to learn, and to grow from those moments of discomfort. As the production crew packed up and the lights dimmed, Jane couldn't help but smile to herself. It had been a long time since an interview had left her with so much to think about. And as the night stretched on, she found herself contemplating the bigger picture. Maybe it wasn't about the battles we fought with others, but about the ones we fought within ourselves. The days following the interview were a whirlwind. The episode had aired, and while the audience's reactions were mixed, There was a noticeable shift in the conversations that followed. Some listeners were moved by the exchange, while others, especially those who had tuned in expecting the usual confrontational style, felt a sense of disappointment. Jane had disrupted the script she had so carefully crafted, and in doing so, she had unintentionally created a different kind of impact, one that was harder to measure, but deeply profound. In the days that followed, Jane received an overwhelming amount of messages, many of them from her listeners who had been forced to reconsider their views. Some of them were questioning their own assumptions, just as she had been forced to do during the interview. Others were more critical, accusing her of going soft on Stallone, of failing to expose the flaws she had promised to address. Jane read them all, her fingers scrolling through the feedback, each comment causing a flicker of doubt in her mind. It was in one of these moments of reflection that she received an unexpected message, an email from Stallone himself. She opened it hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. The message was short but impactful. "Jane," it began, "I know this wasn't the conversation you planned for, but I appreciate the way you listened. It's not easy to admit when we're wrong, or when we don't have all the answers. But that's how we learn, and that's how we grow. I hope this conversation helped you see things a little differently, just as it helped me." It was a simple message, but one that spoke volumes. Jane sat back in her chair, taking a deep breath as the weight of Stallone's words settled in. He wasn't just another celebrity sending a polite thank you. He was acknowledging something deeper, something real. He was showing her the kind of strength he had spoken about during the interview. The strength to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, and to embrace change. As the days passed, Jane found herself thinking more about what Stallone had said. The more she reflected on the interview, the more she realized how much she had underestimated him. She had come in ready to challenge him, to expose his flaws, but in the end, it was she who had been exposed. Not in a humiliating way, but in a way that forced her to question her own assumptions and beliefs. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that perhaps the world didn't need more confrontations, more arguments over who was right or wrong. Maybe what the world needed more of was understanding, listening, compassion. These weren't words often associated with the podcast industry, but they were the words that had stayed with Jane in the aftermath of her conversation with Stallone. A week after the interview, Jane felt different. She wasn't sure if it was because of the flood of messages or the internal shift she had experienced, but something inside her had changed. The world of heated debates, sharp words, and quick judgments no longer seemed as appealing as it once had. She had spent so many years carving out a niche for herself as a fierce interviewer, the one who didn't let anyone off easy. But now, she couldn't help but wonder if she had been missing something all along. That evening, she sat in her studio, the same chair she had occupied countless times during past interviews. The setup was familiar. Lights, microphones, cameras, but it felt different now. She wasn't sure what the next step was, but she knew one thing for sure. She no longer wanted to follow the same formula. She didn't want to be the person who just pushed people to their limits for the sake of drama. She wanted to engage in conversations that left both her and her guests with something meaningful to take away. The next episode of her podcast was set to air in 2 days, and Jane knew she had to make a decision. She had a guest lined up, a political analyst known for his hardline views and controversial takes. It would be easy, she thought, to stick with the usual routine. Ask the tough questions, push him into a corner, and wait for the fireworks. That was the formula that worked, right? But as she sat there in the quiet of the studio, reflecting on the way Stallone had handled her questions, Jane knew that wasn't the path she wanted to take anymore. She wanted something deeper, something more authentic. Maybe it was time to stop focusing on the fight and start focusing on the conversation. She picked up her phone and dialed the guest number. When he answered, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I want to try something different," she said, her voice steady but unsure. "Instead of following the usual script, I want us to have an open conversation. No agenda, no gotcha moments. Just a genuine discussion about the things that matter most to both of us." There was a long pause on the other end. "Are you sure?" the guest asked, clearly taken aback. "This isn't like you." "I know," Jane replied, "but it's something I need to try. I'm tired of following the same patterns. Let's see where it takes us." The guest agreed, albeit reluctantly, and Jane felt a sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, She was stepping away from the confrontational style that had defined her career. She was taking a chance on something uncertain, something new. As she hung up the phone, Jane smiled to herself. She didn't know what the future held for her podcast, but she knew one thing. This was the start of a new chapter, one where she wasn't just asking questions to challenge her guests, but to understand them, to listen. The day of the interview arrived, and Jane felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was unfamiliar territory for her, a place where she wasn't going in with a pre-planned script, where she wasn't pushing for confrontation or a sensational soundbite. For the first time, she was going to let the conversation unfold naturally. She didn't know exactly how it would turn out, but she was ready to embrace the unknown. As the guest walked into the studio, Jane was struck by how different the atmosphere felt compared to her previous interviews. Gone was the usual tension, the anticipation of a verbal showdown. Instead, there was a sense of calm, almost a quiet curiosity, as they both sat down, the microphones now a mere formality in the space between them. "Thank you for agreeing to do this," Jane said, her voice softer than it had been in the past. "I wanted to do something different today, and I hope we can have a genuine conversation about the things that matter most to both of us." The guest, who had initially been skeptical, seemed to relax upon hearing Jane's sincerity. He nodded, his arms uncrossing as he leaned forward. "I'm curious to see where this goes," he admitted. "This is definitely a new approach for you." Jane smiled, feeling the weight of her decision settle in her chest. "It feels right," she said simply. "I think we've all gotten so caught up in the drama of debates and arguments that we've forgotten how to really listen to each other. Today, I just want to talk, to hear your thoughts and share some of mine." The interview began without the usual sharp questions, and for the first time, Jane felt her guard lower. The conversation flowed naturally, and she found herself engaged in a way she hadn't been in years. They discussed everything from politics to personal beliefs, and instead of the usual snappy responses or counterarguments, Jane found herself listening intently. She wasn't preparing her next question in her head. She was absorbing what the guest was saying, understanding his point of view, even if she didn't always agree with it. The guest, too, seemed to relax as the conversation unfolded. He was used to being challenged, to defending his views with force. But today, Jane wasn't attacking. She was simply asking questions that invited reflection, questions that encouraged him to elaborate on the motivations behind his beliefs. It wasn't about winning a debate. It was about discovering the deeper layers of their conversation. At one point, the guest paused, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, "this feels different. I'm used to people coming at me with accusations, but here I feel like I'm actually being understood." Jane nodded, a small smile on her lips. "I think that's what's missing in so many discussions today, the willingness to understand before we judge. It's easy to dismiss someone's views without truly listening to where they're coming from. But when we listen, we might just learn something that changes how we see the world." The interview ended, but the sense of fulfillment that Jane felt lingered long after the cameras turned off. As the guest left the studio, thanking her for the conversation, Jane sat in the quiet of the room, reflecting on how far she had come. This wasn't just a new approach for her podcast. It was a new approach to life. She had spent so much time focused on being right, on proving her point, that she had forgotten the power of understanding. She looked at the recording equipment in front of her, knowing that this was the beginning of something different. The future of her podcast no longer depended on the confrontations she could spark or the headlines she could generate. It depended on the conversations she could nurture, the stories she could help unfold, and the perspective she could help bring to light. In that moment, Jane realized something profound. True strength didn't come from being the loudest voice in the room. It came from being the one who listened. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.